Bacon says, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. It's a very important point. It works in physics and chemistry. Before you can do anything with physics or chemistry, you must discover what physics will allow you to do. You have to. The world teaches you how to manipulate the world, but unless you are willing to do what the world tells you to do, unless you're willing to obey the world, you will never make the world behave. And that when you deal with organisms, it's even more so the case. I remember when I first started working with rats in my first experiments, I would arrange an experiment, and I would expect to get a certain shaped curve. I wouldn't get that, and I would get so furious. Why don't you do what you're supposed to do? Damn the rat. The rat is supposed to do it. And then I realized finally, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. The rat is always right. Whatever the rat does, it should do. But I had not arranged the right conditions.
B.F. Skinner ranks as one of the most important psychologists of the 20th century. He's been at the same time admired, honored, and maligned as a behavioral scientist, as a philosopher of science, and as an educational and social innovator. In spite of his worldwide fame, B.F. Skinner's accomplishments are not easy to categorize or even to describe. Although his favorite experimental lab animal is the pigeon, he himself cannot be pigeonholed. Hello, I'm Murray Sidman. About a year ago, Davidson Films asked me if I would help them to prepare and narrate a film about the life and accomplishments of B.F. Skinner. He taught us that we are what we do, but more to the point, he taught us that we can change what we do for the better. I agreed because I felt that it was of first importance to tell people about this unusual man. And so I said I would do whatever I could. During the year, I worked hard. I wrote my recollections about the man and what he did, and I worked with Davidson Films on the script. I have my notes here with me, and now I want to share my thoughts with you. Now, Skinner's work was about behavior, initially that of lab animals, but with more and more applications to humans in ever larger groups. Although the focus of his science was always on individuals, his later writings dealt with how we, through understanding our own behavior, could restructure social systems to improve life for ourselves and for the planet Earth. The broader the scope of Skinner's work, the greater the outcry against it. For a person who accomplished so much, Skinner's boyhood seems unremarkable. Nothing in his early history seems to predict that he would do extraordinary work. Burrhus Frederick Skinner, known to his friends as Fred, was born in 1904 in a small Pennsylvania railroad town where his parents had also grown up. Skinner's childhood was warm and stable. He was punished only rarely and enjoyed many opportunities for independent experience. He did, however, receive instruction from his lawyer father about the terrible consequences of criminal action, and he got advice from his mother to avoid deviations from what society considered right. And he had warnings from his grandmother about the eventual wages of sin, the horrors of hell. These experiences perhaps led to his early and lasting disenchantment with organized religion, and to his lifelong personal and professional opposition to behavioral control through punishment and threat. Young Skinner and his friends enjoyed exploring nature in the countryside and building things like this cabin in the woods. The continuation of this gadgeteering was later to result in the invention of new and significant devices for use in behavioral experiments. At Hamilton College, The only indication that his later accomplishment might prove extraordinary was his generally rebellious conduct, which almost caused the administration to refuse him his degree. He was accepted into Harvard's Department of Psychology in 1928, after little more than a brief interview. Today, of course, getting into graduate school is not quite so simple. Three major currents affected the intellectual life of the 1920s and were to affect Skinner's work: Darwin's theory of evolution, Freud's psychoanalysis, and behaviorism, particularly as it sprang from Pavlov's research on conditioning. About 70 years before Skinner's entrance into Harvard, Charles Darwin had published his monumental On the Origin of Species, which proposed that all life forms on Earth had evolved from simpler forms over millions of years. Humans, too, were seen as a product of this natural evolution, the progression that resulted from the natural environment's selection of characteristics that contribute to individual survival. Skinner would link his behavioral observations to Darwin's explanation of how nature works, and suggested that a selection process applied also to behavior. Skinner's descriptive term, selection by consequences, although inspired by Darwin's natural selection, sprang from his own experimental observations and broke new ground. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, a product of the early 20th century, proposed that people's adult behavior was largely a reaction to very early experiences. For Freud, people did not act freely, but were driven by motivations and mental states that were largely unknown to them. Many of Skinner's most vocal critics would come from the field of psychoanalysis, but Skinner and Freud did have some things in common. For example, the notion that our behavior has identifiable causes with predictable effects and is not the product of free will was quite in harmony with Skinner's beliefs. Skinner would, however, adamantly reject Freud's appeal to unobservable mental constructs like ego, id, and superego as causes of behavior. For him, such inventions contribute little to our understanding because we then have to explain their behavior as well. The third influence was the infant field of behaviorism, often seen as descended from the work of Pavlov, who was not himself a psychologist. Especially important to Skinner's approach to scientific methodology were the meticulous and creative experiments of Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist who won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his studies of the digestive system. But Pavlov's more important work was on the conditioning of behavior. With it, he showed how biological reactions come to be elicited by environmental stimuli. First, Pavlov showed that a small amount of food in a dog's mouth would cause the animal to salivate. Nothing surprising here. This is how the animal functions physiologically, in direct contact with food. Then, along with or just before presenting the food, Pavlov set a metronome ticking that had no effect on salivation at first. After a few such pairings of the metronome with the food, Pavlov observed that the ticking of the metronome itself, even without the food, would cause the dog to salivate. Now this was surprising. The previously ineffective metronome now made the animal salivate. The metronome tick is a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation is now a conditioned response. Many American psychologists, led by the famous behaviorist John B. Watson, were excited by Pavlov's findings. Like Pavlov, Skinner initially studied the physical reactions of lab animals, but soon moved beyond to their observable acts. Although Skinner shared the earlier behaviorists' insistence on dealing with observable behavior and its relations to the environment, he also would argue that the same principles could be applied to behavior that we cannot directly observe, like thinking and feeling. It was of prime importance to Skinner that what we do, think, and feel can be studied by the methods of science and can be described and predicted by scientific laws. This was a feature of the work that attracted many students, me included. Advances in scientific theory and practice often are made possible by the development of new laboratory apparatus and techniques. These permit us to see things never seen before and to see familiar things more clearly. Skinner at Harvard was soon putting his mechanical skills to work, inventing new devices for use in experiments that would make behavior more understandable. Best known is the closed environment, often called the Skinner box, a term he himself rejected. Skinner's first discovery was simply that laboratory animals would continue to peck a disc if they could get food that way. But this discovery was not quite as simple as it seems. Skinner recognized that there was more involved here than just an animal's getting food. In a bold generalization that has held up remarkably well, he asserted that not just lab animals, but any animals, and humans too, would repeat any activity that produced consequences that he called reinforcers. For us humans, flicking switches, for example, produces many different kinds of reinforcers. But it all starts much earlier, and it goes on throughout life. Behavior that gets certain results gets repeated. The second thing Skinner realized was that the sequence of events here was just the reverse of what happened in Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov got his dog to salivate in response to a stimulus, the metronome. Pavlov's and Watson's work led to a stimulus-response psychology that many have recognized as too simplified and mechanistic to account for the great variety of human behavior. But Skinner got his animal to peck a disc not by presenting it with a stimulus beforehand, but instead by presenting a consequence afterward. The important event here was the food that came after the animal pecked the disc. This was no longer stimulus-response psychology. If anything, it was response-stimulus psychology, but still more was involved. Skinner's operant behavior consists of acts that operate on the environment, producing consequences that determine how likely the acts are to be repeated.
Raise your hand if you want something.
If you want to know why someone is doing or saying some particular thing, look first at what happens immediately after the act. If you can change that consequence, you will probably change the future likelihood of the act. Skinner's realization that behavior is governed by consequences was a milestone in the scientific study of behavior, analogous to Darwin's formulation of natural selection. Darwin was concerned with species characteristics that are selected over millions of years. But Skinner was concerned with the selection of behavior from the variety of actions that each individual is capable of, a process that we can see taking place during an individual's lifetime. Critical words here are behavior, selection, and individual. Skinner's work was focused on observable actions, not theoretical constructs. He was interested in why one behavior was selected from the many possibilities available to any organism at any point in time. He was also concerned with individuals. Skinner did not group individuals statistically and merge their results into averages. If some individual acted differently from another, he wanted to know why. Skinner proposed that the critical relation between behavior and environment can be conceived of as a contingency of reinforcement. Consequences, in this case food, are contingent on some act. Here, disc pecking. Contingent means dependent on. It defines an if-then relation. If the pigeon in this chamber pecks the lighted disc, it then gets food. Depending on the type of consequence, the act will or will not be selected. This pigeon will soon be ringing the bell, as you will see, but it starts out doing many other things. Skinner discovered that one could mold behavior from one variation to another, ending up with an act that was completely out of the range of anything the organism had ever done before. Starting with reinforcement for just turning toward the bell, closer approaches are then required. This gradual molding of behavior Skinner called shaping. This pigeon's behavior has been shaped into ringing a bell by requiring closer approximations to the desired behavior before giving it food. The process validates Skinner's assertion that selection by consequences is a fact, not a theory. Anyone can see it happening. But Skinner did not stop here. It was clear to him that simple two-term reinforcement contingencies were not enough. Skinner's research showed that the environment not only provides consequences that select and maintain particular behavior, but that the environment also selects from an organism's repertoire of two-term units the particular ones that will be active at any moment. Notice this pigeon has 3 discs available, but only pecks the lighted one. The bird only gets food by pecking at the lighted disc. Skinner calls things like the light discriminative stimuli. These stimuli allow animals and people to discriminate, to make distinctions, by signaling that certain reinforcements will be available if they act in a certain way. Pavlovian conditioned stimuli usually trigger physiological reactions that have some natural relation to the unconditioned stimulus, like salivation in Pavlov's original experiments. Discriminative stimuli, however, signal opportunities for us to do something that is likely to produce reinforcers. For example, the sight of food on the table is likely to make us salivate, Pavlovian conditioning. It also may lead to our picking up a knife and fork, operant conditioning. Discriminative stimuli control when and where we do things. By adding the third term, discriminative stimulus, to the reinforcement contingency, along with response and consequence, Skinner greatly broadened the applicability of operant conditioning. The 3-term contingency is the basic unit of operant behavior. Without the third term, discriminative stimulus, to control when and where we act in certain ways, we would be trying to do everything all at once. Instead, in any given situation, we respond in the same way as was reinforced in a similar situation in the past. The scope of operant conditioning was widened still further when Skinner discovered that discriminative stimuli, because they lead to reinforcement, can also act as conditioned reinforcers themselves. In our own lives, a prime example of this is money. Money acts as a discriminative stimulus that leads to many different kinds of reinforcers. Money offers us so many opportunities to buy so many reinforcers that it becomes a powerful reinforcer itself. Other aspects of the environment, too, signal the availability of reinforcers and become conditioned reinforcers themselves. The environmental events that become conditioned reinforcers are virtually limitless. Reinforcers have 2 defining features, both of them necessary and directly observable. First, a reinforcer must follow an action. This pigeon received grain after moving toward the bell. Second, for a consequence to be reinforcing, it must cause the action to be repeated or to happen more often. This hungry pigeon is pecking the bell more than it had before because of receiving the grain when it pecks. Positive reinforcement refers to the addition of something that had not been there before a certain action occurs. Flipping this switch brings this teenager music. Negative reinforcement refers to the removal of something that had been present before an action was taken. This parent is escaping the music by flipping the switch the other way. Punishment would occur if, when the teenager brought home some bad grades, the parent denied her the use of the radio or made her perform extra chores. Punishment and negative reinforcement are often mistakenly equated. Punishment occurs whenever an action is followed by either a loss of positive reinforcers, for instance, use of the radio, or the addition of negative reinforcers, like extra chores. Skinner's experiments showed that even if punishment does stop undesirable behavior, it either works only temporarily or produces unwanted side effects, like escape, anxiety, or avoidance behavior that can be long-lasting. Skinner was not an advocate of punishment. A significant advance occurred in psychology when Skinner recognized that the rate at which any particular act occurs is the most important feature to measure in studying and describing behavior. For him, rate was a convenient way to measure an act's probability. And that is what we're interested in, isn't it? When we characterize someone as talkative, it means they talk a lot. When we wonder why our friend is so smart, it's because we have seen her always doing well on exams. When we become annoyed with a lazy roommate, we are reacting to his frequent avoidance of chores. All of these come out of our observations of high or low frequencies of whatever behavior we're currently looking at. Skinner realized, of course, that in the real world, little of our behavior is always reinforced. He therefore invented techniques to find out what happens to acts that are only reinforced occasionally. Here, for example, the pigeon gets fed each time it pecks, while this pigeon is fed only after 3 pecks, and this one only if it pecks after a period of time has elapsed. These are called reinforcement schedules. Skinner discovered a surprising fact about reinforcement schedules. After reinforcement is discontinued completely, acts that have been reinforced less frequently persist longer than acts that are reinforced each time.
People gamble because of the schedule of the reinforcement that follows, and this is true of all gambling systems. They all have variable ratios built into them. So what we've learned from the pigeon, it made it possible to interpret this vast field very effectively.
These, then, are the core elements of the operant conditioning that Skinner discovered in his animal labs in the 1930s, and which he described in his first book, The Behavior of Organisms, published in 1938. The animal apparatus he had invented became standard in labs across the world, and the new science of behavior analysis was born. 1938 was also the year that Skinner's first child was born. It was perhaps this family life that caused him to place greater emphasis on the significance his work held for practical human concerns. This change in emphasis was to make him a very controversial figure. The first major public controversy erupted over, of all things, a baby's sleeping arrangements. His daughters, Julie Vargas and Deborah Buzan, tell the story best.
But in any case, when Mother was pregnant again, I could just see what she said. She would have said, "Fred, can't you do something to make this easier?" And he would say, "Oh, well, yes, I think I can do something." And he would go downstairs and he'd put together this heated sleeping space. And one of the misconceptions is that it was used for something, I mean, that Deborah was in it most of the time. But
I didn't live in this thing. I was in there as an infant. Essentially, I was out and about as a neo baby. I mean, this has been a widely misinterpreted aspect
Yes,
of the
right.
baby box that I was in there the whole time. And I apparently didn't have any colds for several years, and I apparently didn't even cry for quite a few months, which is pretty amazing. I think if my father had been a writer of fiction or a traveling salesman or whatever, nobody would have thought anything of this invention. It's the very fact that he actually did have animals in boxes that people would, of course, naturally make the connection. He puts his child in a box and think, oh my God, he's experimenting on his kid.
But I remember very many times when he would put us to bed, he would sit on the side and he would reach over and squeeze your hand, and tears would come to his eyes. And I could never understand why when I was a little girl. And now I can understand perfectly.
Skinner was a remarkably devoted father, and through his concern about his daughter's education came another application of his research and his inventive skills, the teaching machine.
It was Father's Day at Shady Hill, and he came to visit classes and went to Deborah's math class, sat at the back, and saw what was then a typical lesson, which is today a typical lesson. Teacher goes up and on the blackboard says, this is how you do addition with carryings, or whatever it was. Well, fourth grade it would have been more advanced, but adding fractions, say. And then give some papers to the students, and the students are supposed to do their assignments. Well, it was very obvious to him that some of the kids already knew it. Some of the kids hadn't the foggiest idea of how you start. And when the papers were given out, some of them could do it, some of them were bored. It just was not effective. And he'd spent hours and hours and hours in the pigeon lab, and he knew about shaping behavior, and this was just violating every single principle. So he was attending a lecture later on the day, and Dick Hernstein went in to the lecture and found him sitting there early. He was always early to everything. In the back of the auditorium, and he was cutting out cardboard. And Dick said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm making a teaching machine. And the idea of the teaching machine was that you could go at your own pace. The student was always actively responding rather than sitting and watching a lecture. And that you would get immediate feedback for each response. You see, in a classroom, you do a whole sheet before you find out whether any of them are correct, if you find out then.
Skinner's teaching machines suffered from the awkwardness of the mechanical technology that was available at the time. The mechanics of the teaching machine are now better carried out by the personal computer. But the behavioral principles that Skinner followed in designing his are just as relevant today. Unfortunately, only a few computer-assisted instruction courses use the meticulous programming that is necessary for effective teaching. This is a wide-open field for the creative application of behavioral principles. Other psychologists have developed teaching methods that do not depend on hardware, but are based on Skinnerian principles. In this Montana school, children are using timed drills to monitor their progress on math skills. Tracking the children's responses for accuracy and rate is crucial for both the pupils and the teachers. Verbal behavior was a topic Skinner had started to work on back in his graduate school days, but it took him almost 25 years to refine his analysis to the point where he was willing to publish it. Only now is the book starting to get the recognition it deserves. It deals with that most human of activities, social communication, oral speech, writing, and body gestures.
Just finish this. All you gotta do is
Skinner suggested the social communication, whether in oral, written, or signed forms, is made up of learned behavior that arises from and is maintained through the same operant conditioning processes as any other behavior. Verbal behavior should be analyzed by observing how it functions. At this school, the Stars School in Walnut Creek, California, the verbal behavior of children with severe language delays is analyzed and treated both in group and individual sessions. Jeffrey is a 6-year-old boy with autism who can only say a few words.
Can you give me the brush? Yeah, good. Can you give me
Professionals at the school have taught him several signs from American Sign Language as a way to name and to ask for things.
Oh, you want the pen?
Jeffrey has been taught not only to ask for things, but to name them as well.
Look at this, Jeffrey. What's that? Sock. Good job. What do you want? Tickle, tickle.
Notice what's happening here in terms of the three-part contingency. Jeffrey is being helped to name something, the discriminative stimulus. His correct response is immediately followed by reinforcement that Jeffrey relishes.
What do you want? Say.
Incorrect responses are ignored, and a new attempt immediately made with prompts or hints to help evoke the correct word.
Up. Good job. What's that?
Careful records are kept of these sessions to follow Jeffrey's progress. This is another form of the individual recordings of data seen earlier with the pigeons. Sign language training continues in less formal situations with the aim of getting the child to communicate verbally outside the therapy sessions. Skinner's analysis in verbal behavior went far beyond the important topic of individual communication. His analysis also dealt with the way verbal behavior widened the scope of individual experience, allowing us to pass on inventions, cultural practices, discoveries, and skills over time and space. Using these verbal records, we have been able to modify our environments for both evil and good. The wide-ranging field of behavior analysis, based on Skinnerian principles, has resulted in many improvements to the human condition. I experienced the power of operant conditioning to help people learn new behavior when I worked for many years with people who were living in an institution. Conditions verged on the barbaric for many of those people at the time, and behavioral therapies have resulted in enormous and positive changes, allowing them to lead more productive lives in the community. Animal training has also been a widespread application. Here, a young dog is being trained to serve as a guide dog for the blind. He is being reinforced with praise for stopping at obstacles. Obstacles are not just physical.
When you bow, and that's a sign of respect. But in this country, you know, it's the firm handshake and you look them in the eye. That's how you show people respect. Hi, I'm Yoshi.
I'm Samnat.
Nice.
These young Cambodian American boys are being taught social skills like handshaking that will allow them to succeed more easily in the dominant culture. In this session, they are being reinforced by tokens that they can then spend in an informal snack bar.
You don't use a conspicuous reinforcer, as I call it, a reward, like a token, unless you need to. If you have a disrupted classroom, boys and girls running all over the place, you need to make some very clear contingencies of reinforcement, to use my own terminology on this, to get them settled down. But once they're settled down and begin to be reinforced by the natural consequences of being quiet and getting somewhere, then you can dispense with the cruder types of reinforcers.
In the second half of his life, Skinner increasingly devoted himself to writing, largely on applications of operant conditioning to the human condition. In Walden 2, a novel, he proposed a plan for a utopian community governed by positive reinforcement. This community, Los Horcones, in northern Mexico, has been in existence since 1973 and consists of 3 generations of several families who have constructed a productive environment for themselves based on Skinnerian principles of behavior analysis. Skinner's interest in how environments shape human interactions and how human life can be improved by the application of behavior analysis can perhaps best be seen in his own environment, a basement study which he designed to support the writing that was the focus of his life. He was his own best human subject.
This file here is all of the topics in which he was currently interested. Here is a copy of just the drafts as he threw them as he was finished. So you can see it's still got a lot of changes, and this would have probably been at least a 10th draft. He had difficulty with his eyes in the later years, so he bought this magnifying glass. It was on an arm, but he couldn't adjust it so that it was exactly where he wanted it. So he made up this system. He put wood on, he glued the whole thing, you can see with hot glue here, onto a wooden frame with these arms, which were also hot glued, ran fishing wire up to the ceiling, over to the wall, and down to some weights, which made it possible to raise and lower this and to put it in any position that he wanted it. And then he would, of course, look through it.
Future historians, with the help of data that requires the passage of time and evaluations of Skinner's accomplishments in relation to many other developments, will have the task of placing Skinner's work in its proper perspective. I can only tell you why it has been important to me and my colleagues. First, Skinner's work provided me with a scientific methodology, with precise experimental methods, with ways to investigate the behavior not of a mythical average organism, but of real individuals. Second, Skinner's work acquainted me with new findings about behavior. You have only seen a few of the many in this video. Third, Skinner's organization of these findings into a set of general principles enabled others, including me, to apply the new knowledge in ways that went far beyond his own personal contributions.
Good girl, thank you.
Here, in his last lecture, he sums up what he thought his work had been about.
Looking back on my life, 62 years as a psychologist, I would say that what I have tried to do, what I've been doing, is to make that point clear, to show how selection by consequences in the individual can be demonstrated in the laboratory with animals and with human subjects, and to show the implications of that for the world at large, in not only the profession of psychology, but in consideration of what is going to happen to the world unless some very vital changes are made. Any evidence that I've been successful in that is what I should like to be remembered by. I'll once again thank you for this award and for your attention.